The Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network presents The Monstrous Regiment, featuring a roundtable of Dominion women seeking to honor Jesus Christ in applying God's Word fearlessly and faithfully in all callings and seasons of life, both in and out of the home, reversing the curse and smashing pagan strongholds.
Is adoption a biblical mandate? Is adoption a biblical mandate? I'm Tony Kolb with the Monstrous Regiment, and I'm going to be interviewing Dawn Haines. And Dawn, why don't you go ahead and just give us a little bit of your background?
Yes, my name is Dawn Haines, and I'm 53 years old, soon to be 54, and I'm happily married to my husband for almost 29 years now.
Wow.
And when we got married in 1990, and we thought we would have 3 or 4 children, and God's providence was that we would go through infertility. And after going through infertility for a number of years, we ended up adopting 2 precious children, miraculously, domestically, and then miraculously got pregnant with 4 children. And then after getting pregnant with 4 children, had 2 miscarriages, and we're like, oh my goodness, we couldn't end our family on 2 miscarriages, even though we had 6 children already. And so we adopted a little boy from Guatemala. And then after that, the day that we left to get him, I found out I was pregnant with our 5th biological daughter. And then after that, we were like, okay, we have 8 kids. We're doing pretty well. And our oldest daughter prayed that we would consider adopting from China. And so we started praying about adopting from China, and we adopted 2 little boys back to back. And then we came home with them from China. And then all the kids said, we need to adopt the little one with Down syndrome, and we need to go to Albania. And we found a little girl in the waiting child list, and we brought her home. And then after that, everybody who had been at the orphanage, I took 8 of our kids with us, all said we have to continue to adopt because there's a lot of kids. And they all said, how old can you and Dad be before you have to stop adopting? And I said, well, we're not that old yet. I guess we can keep adopting. And so we adopted a little girl last year, and now we're in process to adopt. And she was from China, and we are adopting a little girl from Bulgaria and hoping to go meet her for the first time in April of this year. So we have 12 children, and we're in the process for our 13th.
Wow. Yes, how I actually know of you is through your son's video about the adoption of your daughter with Down syndrome, and which was absolutely amazing. And I've gotten to know Connor a little bit and just think he's an amazing young man. But then watching his video of your family, you just became one of my heroes. Really, truly. I love the story. So you kind of already started to tell us that what started your adoption journey was the fact that you were infertile. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. And so I'm just curious that you have many children and everything. What do you tell people who say, "Oh, well, that's good for you. That's your calling, and we're really impressed with that, but we really couldn't handle that, or we really don't want to look into that at this time." What do you tell people?
Well, one of the things we say is that we're not called to anything but salvation. And when you look at Scripture, if you Google the word "called" or look it up in any of your Bible commentaries, the word "called" is always used in relation to our salvation and a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so I would look, just even before I got on this call tonight, it's like 1 Thessalonians 2:12 and 1 Corinthians 1:9. There's a whole bunch of verses about being called and called into fellowship with the Lord and He who calls us. And we are not called to adoption, nor is anyone called to a specific ministry. We're given different gifts. That's very clear in the Word. And we all have different gifts and different talents and different abilities. And God prepared good works for us in advance to do. But the word called is inappropriately used, I believe, and the scripture does command us to do something. It doesn't say specifically adoption, but God's heart, the Father's heart, is towards adoption without a doubt. The Bible says that he sets the lonely in families, and he's the father to the fatherless, a defender of widows. He watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow. I mean, just verse after verse of his care and his love for the fatherless. And there's a quote that I did not write down because I had screenshotted it. I wasn't sure we were going to be videoing, so I thought I would have a chance to pull it up. But it's by Francis Chan, and maybe I can give it to you at some point. But he shares with him in the quote about assume action. He goes, so many times we are looking for God to give us, clear, should we adopt, should we not, and basically to all Christian couples should assume adoption unless God says no. And I really believe that there's a lot of wisdom and validity in that. And I think that if the church were to embrace that and people were to run towards that, like assume that God wants you to, have either foster care children in your home or adopted children in your home, or taking in even unofficially, being a mentor or someone who's caring for children who otherwise wouldn't have a place to be. I think that we would have a clearer understanding of the gospel, because the more we practice doing what the Father does in our lives, it gives us a real clear picture. So
yes, that's for a lot of people, even the church, that's very radical thought process. And sometimes a lot of people will say, well, I'm financially not well off. I can't really afford an adoption, and I know that your family has obviously done quite a few. Can you share maybe a little bit, like how you afforded that and what you would encourage other couples with?
sure. It always comes back to faith. Absolutely. I think that even when we got married and we were, when we faced infertility, we realized having children was a matter of faith. And just letting God control our family size was a step of faith. And I think that a lot of times Christians, we like to use the word faith, but when it comes to actually exercising it, it's a whole different matter. And so we've come to realize that in Psalm 50 verse 10, it says that God owns a cattle on 1,000 hills, and he owns it all. And so if obviously we know his heart is towards the fatherless, we know that he loves the fatherless, he wants to set them in families. So why would he not provide for us if we're willing to take that step of faith? And he has time and time again, without a doubt. He has been so incredibly faithful, whether it's my husband coming home one day with a bonus check that he wasn't anticipating and putting on the counter and said, well, this is for the next adoption, or whether it's been talking about from friends of ours who went to the Ukraine to adopt 2 children at the same time. And when they left, they needed $10,000 more, and they didn't know where they were going to come up with it. And the wife went to go pick up these 2 little girls. And while she was there, they kept praying that the Lord would bless them with the money. And as they were there, the country said, oh, these 2 girls have accounts that we set up for them for like caring for some of their medical needs, etc. And she had heard from other families that those accounts usually had about $7.62 in them, like nothing. And she's like, oh yeah, well, sure, we'll take the money, thinking I'll buy myself a drink or turn it around and give it to the orphanage for diapers or something. And
yes,
they turned around and handed her the money from the account. It was $10,000 from the 2 accounts. And so their daughters' adoptions were paid for by these accounts that, like, for any unknown reason, the country was giving them money to bring these girls home. So, I think about the gold coin in the mouth of the fish when, Jesus said, go, down, you could pay the tax. It's right there. He has it all. We just need to ask. And so our last adoption, the last 2 adoptions, we actually did a fundraiser called Both Hands, which is amazing. 1 hand for the orphan, 1 hand for the widow, based on James 1:27. And the process is basically, instead of running a 5K, you work on a widow's house and you get people to sponsor you to work on a widow's house. And the money that comes in, all the money that is donated is put towards the adoption, and all the expenses for the widow's house are from the local businesses that donate their time, their money for free paint and whatever.
Yeah.
And we raised $42,000 for our last adoption. We only needed 35,000. So it was like the loaves and the fishes. We had 7,000 left over, and we
Yeah.
were able to turn around and give that money to another adoptive couple. So God,
Wow.
finances, if someone says finances are a problem, it's really faith. They need to go back and realize that their concern is not really about finances. It's really about trusting God and having the faith to believe that he will do what he says he will do.
And that makes sense, right? When I'm just thinking of how we apply that in all sorts of different areas. We obey first, and then God provides,
Yeah.
and so it makes sense with adoption. I think people just have a lot of concerns because it's such a huge step. It's such a something that's going to affect the rest of their lives and this child's life, and so people do start to get uncomfortable thinking, well, I don't have all this money, but you are living proof that obedience has its rewards and God does provide. That's awesome. So another thing, some people worry about how their biological children will adapt to having adopted siblings. And I just wanted to ask you, how did your biological children adapt, and how did they also participate in your adoptions?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we started off with adoption. So our first two are adopted, and then we had 4 bios there in the middle, and then another adoption, another bio, etc. But our older kids were adopted, so our bio kids grew up with adopted siblings right from the beginning.
Yeah.
But honestly, they're the ones who run with it. In fact, I could go upstairs and grab out 4 or 5 letters that our kids have written us over the years, whether it's, with, $10 tucked in with a note saying, take a step of faith, we need to adopt this child, or whether it's a poster that was hung up around the house saying, this child needs a family. When are you and Dad going to realize we need to move forward? The bottom line is that we say that our kids are the ones that have driven our adoptions. We were very content with 8 kids, and our older daughter, Lauren, was 16 at the time and was praying that we would consider going to China to adopt. And the question didn't become, should we go? It became, why wouldn't we go? Basically, we have a home, homeschooling, we have the resources medically, etc. Like, it would be, basically, we saw it as being selfish not to. And when there's all these millions of children that need families. So basically, our kids have really been the ones that have said, you have our blessing. And we've said, well, this may mean that someday you will have to care for, a sibling that has special need when you're an adult. And when we were looking at adopting Kiara, my husband was very nervous about adopting a little girl with Down syndrome. And he said to Emily at the time, I think she was maybe, I don't remember, 12 or whatever. And he says, what are you going to do, like, when you get married, and what if your spouse isn't in agreement? And she looked at him and she said, I'm a born again Christian. I love Jesus with all my heart. And she said, I would never marry someone who wouldn't let one of my siblings move in because they have special needs. And she said, so you're crazy to think that I would even marry someone who wouldn't have the same heart that I have towards my siblings. And so it has been our kids who have driven the adoption. In fact, people say, well, it's not really fair. You're robbing your kids of time and attention, and there's less dates and less time to do things, And our kids will say that they would not, even on the hard days, would not trade in their adoptive siblings because they're the ones who have advocated to bring them here.
Well, yeah, that was going to be my other question, because you do have many children according to our culture, and I just wondered, have people ever approached you about your family size or criticized you for your family size?
Yeah, basically, our family size has been really an intriguing conversation starter for most non-believers. They really are like kind of they think of you as like they call me a saint, and I go back and say, yeah, I am a saint, but because I have a relationship with Jesus Christ, not the way you put me as a saint because you think I have all these kids and I've done a heroic deed. So try to use that as a springboard for conversation with the gospel. Um, and they having many adopted kids has given us great opportunities. We have Connor, who you mentioned earlier, made these gospel track cards that share the gospel. There's a picture of our adopted kids on the front, or what each kid has their own card, and with them on the front, with basically the gospel message on the back. And it's just a great opportunity to get the gospel into people's hands, because people will not turn down a card with a photo of a child on it, especially when my kids like to give out their own photo cards. So they'll hand a card to someone, and then someone has the gospel, and you don't, when you don't have an opportunity to share it. So our family size has been nothing but a blessing. Especially with non-Christians. I think the most criticism we get is from the church. We happen to be going to a church right now that has larger families, so we don't get that necessarily from where we are now. But I think in general, the church is the one that does not see children. Again, it's a step of faith, because they don't see, when Jesus said, call the little children unto himself, and blessed is a man whose quiver is full of them. It's just, those are the verses that I think Christians tend to forget. And I think it makes them uncomfortable, because when you become radically obedient to the Lord in the area of letting him control your family size, and then radically obedient and adopting, and radically obedient, we're taking my mom in this year as a widow, and we're building an addition onto our house. I think when people aren't doing that, they feel like they don't measure up. And so it's easier to be critical than it is to be supportive, because being critical, then they don't makes them feel better if they're not doing it. So
yeah, that makes sense.
So,
yeah. And I think that that it is possible for people to neglect their kids or not invest in their children, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the size of the family, because you can do that with one or two kids, or it doesn't.
Yep.
The size isn't it's the parent's heart, right?
Correct. And honestly, I mean, my kids will tell you, that there are sacrifices that will be made. When you have a big family, you might have a night that a sibling puts you to bed because mom and dad are helping somebody else with something. And so that does happen. But the bottom line is that, we make an effort. They all have, for Christmas time, they all get a individual date with mom and dad for the year. And then for their birthdays, we take them out one-on-one for their birthdays. And so we try to, they don't maybe get it as often as they would, but they also have gained a lot that they feel like other kids get ripped off when they have their own bed. They know that their kids are like, I can't imagine having my own bedroom, or, like they laugh, like we miss one or two kids from the dinner table. It's like our family feels like it's really small, and we look around and we're like, well, we still have 8 kids here, and it feels really small. So
well, I know just within my own family, I only have 6 siblings, which kind of sounds small compared to your family, but I know that every time a child was added to my family, it just seemed to expand the love. It didn't seem like there was less love in the house. There was more. When each baby was a new individual person, and it was a celebration. It wasn't something to be sad over.
Yes, and that's been the case with us as well.
Yes. So I was going to ask if you have adopted solely internationally, but I think you did mention in the beginning that you had adopted domestically in the beginning.
Correct.
Okay. Are there any cautions that you would give with international adoption? Any warnings or?
Yeah, basically with international adoption, most of the countries that you can adopt from now, a large majority are Hague countries. And the Hague it protects the children. I'm not saying it's foolproof because I don't think anything governmental is foolproof, but I think that it does have more safeguards attached when there are more requirements and making sure that a child truly has been abandoned, making sure that every effort's been made to try to find a child's parents, etc. So I think that there's a lot more safeguards in place with countries that are participating at the Hague, although there are some countries right now that you can adopt from that aren't Hague accredited, which doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate, and I think that there's a lot of legitimate adoptions that happen there, but I think that children can be trafficked where children are not. I think that's one of the reasons that Guatemala closed down. It was, I mean, speculation is that, there were children that were being, bought, so to speak, and trafficked out. Not necessarily all of them, or even a large majority of them, but I think if it was happening even just to a few.
Okay.
But unfortunately, when that happens, then everybody misses out, and then there's orphanages are too crowded, and kids are struggling, and there's abuse, and so they maybe are being spared being trafficked, but now they have a different set of problems that they're facing.
Right.
So it hasn't been a fix. Let's put it that way. So I think the biggest thing, I would definitely recommend doing your research, finding out what the countries, and how they're finding their children, how did the children come to them, and especially if you were to find a child that's quote unquote 1-year-old healthy child somewhere, my antenna would go up that would be a child that would be likely, have been trafficked in some sort of way, because most of the kids are special needs at this point for international adoption.
Oh, okay. And so you would look to see if that country was, you said Hague,
Hague, Hague.
Oh, okay. And then also, I'm assuming that you also work with kind of a middleman, like an agency that helps you find these kids. Is that true?
That is true. Yep. And we worked with different agencies we've been working with 3 different Christian agencies over the different adoptions we've done, and there are wonderful Christian agencies out there that are definitely advocating to find families for kiddos, and that are really concerned about the welfare of children, and not just placing them for adoption, but also helping them stay in their country of origin if they can, advocating for them to be able to be adopted in country, as well as setting up foster care type situations for these children. So they're long-term care for children, whether it's adoption or just even if they stay in country.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And does that make it maybe more safe too, to make sure that your adoption's ethical, having that middle person?
Yes, and I think that, even with a middle person, I think some of the adoptions from some of the countries that weren't Hague affiliated, I don't think anybody had any idea that kids were maybe being trafficked. I think people thought these were legitimate orphans. I think looking back in hindsight, it's like, oh wow, that does make sense. But I think people had the best interests in mind. I think there were the people that knew what they were doing kept the other people in the dark, so to speak. And I think that, that could still happen, but I think it happens much less frequently. And especially when you have, in China, all the children that come, to an orphanage have been abandoned on the street, have been found. They all have a finding place. They all have their photographed and put into the newspaper. Looking for them, like, if anybody knows the whereabouts of the parents of this said child that was found on the corner of such and such, so they will, try to recruit the parents that way. Most of those children have been placed, in a prominent spot because the parents don't, want any harm to come to them. And they realize that they, with the one-child policy, etc., they aren't able to adopt. raise those child, so they realize that the child's better interest to be adopted, because then they know the child will get the medical care, etc., that they need. So uh,
Yes.
yeah, so
And it is true. You were talking about how many international adoptions, the children are handicapped in some way. I just recently found a site on Instagram called Reese's Rainbow, and they're constantly putting up um, pictures of children that are handicapped that need homes. And I didn't realize that there are so many children out there that are and not they're handicapped, but they'll time out and they're put in institutions where often they can't get the medical treatment that they need, and sometimes they even die in those institutions. And I think a lot of us don't, here in America, we're so sheltered, we're in our happy bubble. We don't even realize the huge need that's out there.
that is true. And honestly, the having gone, taking the kids with us to Albania, which you saw in that movie Grafted that Connor created,
Yeah.
taking the kids there and having them live in Albania for almost 7 weeks and get to go to the orphanage every day. And they were so excited because at first they were allowed to go in and hold the babies and give them their bottles. And then one day the head nun of the orphanage said, "No more going in and feeding the babies." And my children were looked at her like, "Why?" And she's like, "Too much time in the arms, they become spoiled." And she said, "And when you leave, then no one can hold them, and then they cry. So they have to learn to cry and learn that they cannot be cared for when they want to be cared for, and they outgrow it, then they can join the other children." And it was
Wow.
very hard to hear, and my kids just sobbed. We're like, every kid needs to be loved and nurtured and held. And they would just put the babies behind closed doors with their bottles propped with a stuffed animal, and if the bottle slipped out of their mouth, so be it. And it just broke our hearts because we would be there at the orphanage just hearing babies behind the door sobbing. And they had an older girl that was not older, she was only 6, but she was blind, and they would put her to bed at like 4 or 5, between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, and they would put her in the furthest room from all the other children because she was noisy. And she would just be in her room rocking back and forth in her crib or banging on her crib. And a couple of nights I would sneak back there and just sing her a song or just smooth her arm. But I'm like, that's just like one little glimpse of a time that I can help this poor child that needs a mom and a dad, that needs someone to be there 24/7 and care for them. And so having been in these orphanages, and like, it sometimes it's not a lack of love, it's a lack of staff, it's a lack of ability for them to minister to their needs. And it's, unfortunately, these children, need families. And until the church wakes up from its slumber and from its self-indulgence and from its fear and all the other things that are preventing people from running, I said, we, as Christians, if we're really Christians, and that's my concern, I'm like, if we're really Christians, then there should be a list of Christian families waiting for the next child that doesn't have a home, rather than millions of children waiting for families to step forward, while millions of people call themselves Christians and aren't running. I mean, they should be running. And one of my favorite videos, and I can maybe give you the link that you could put on to your site, but it's it's called Depraved Indifference, and it's by Eric and Leslie Ludy out of their ministry. But it is unbelievable because it gives you the focus of that child is God's child, and we should be running to them to rescue them and care for them and minister to them. And there shouldn't be, we shouldn't have children that, if people aren't adopting the healthy-ish ones, then no one's going to be running to get the ones that are really struggling.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right. And you base that belief off of the Bible, right? Like James 1:27 you were mentioning.
Yes.
Yes, where it's talking about that we're literally commanded to take care of the widows and the fatherless, and that, and I think you're right. I think we are blind and apathetic to that commandment. Um, is there anything that you wish you had known beforehand? Is look, hindsight is sometimes really. Is there anything that you could share with us that, for those of us who are looking into adoption, um, maybe some advice?
Yeah, really. I think when we first started adopting, obviously we were doing it to grow our family. And there's nothing wrong with that for people that go through infertility. I mean, that, it's a way to grow your family. It's a way to have children because God has created us, to procreate, to nurture, to have children. And so that's wonderful. But I think that in my mind, we got our daughter, she was 7 hours old, and our son was 7 days old. And in my mind, I was like, well, just love, just lots of love and, the fear and admonition of the Lord, and just train them up in the way they should go. And I did not realize until much later that the attachment and trauma that these children come to you even at 7 hours old and 7 days old, which, just losing their mother's voice, and you think you're expecting, and you've got that baby has heard your voice, has heard your husband's voice, has heard their, your extended family's voices, and to suddenly take that baby and place it in a totally foreign environment, automatically the neural pathways in the brain are shifted. And so if you were to do an MRI of a baby's brain, like your baby that's going to stay with you, and then another baby that was, born the same exact day, and even if you both ate the exact same healthy food and whatever, and that baby were to be, check, both of you, both those babies were to have an MRI and check the brain scan, they would be totally different because of just losing. And then you add on top of that children that have been abandoned, and children that have maybe been abused, and some of the children in the foster care have gone to multiple placements. So once you have all those things, the issue of attachment is really important. So, like, one of the things our social worker encouraged us when we were in country, when we were traveling to China, like, don't bring a stroller, bring a sling, carry your child everywhere, even if they're heavy, just to build that attachment, that connection. And when you get home, don't have big parties and have lots of people over. Spend time at home cocooning. Just be at home as a family, like be in a cocoon and like a bubble, so to speak, and where that child's world is real small, then you gradually let it get bigger. And it's really important to just really, understand that they're coming from what what we now understand is called hard places. They're, just even if they never had any, trauma other than just losing their birth parent, that's
Right.
still trauma. And there's, great books out now. Karen Purvis wrote one called The Connected Child. There's book for those that have been adopted to understand what happened to them. It's called The Primal Wound, to help them understand that what they've had happen to them, and just make a much better understanding of the brain and how it works, and just how to foster good attachment in kids that have come from these what is called hard places. So I guess
Yeah.
that, I still realize that there's still a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding out there now. Most people don't hide adoption from their kids like they used to in the old days. Like they wouldn't, and kids would find out when they're 18 or 21 that they were adopted and things like that. People now know they need to tell their kids, but even so, I think people still don't understand that they are different. And it doesn't mean it's bad. It's just understanding it is just helpful.
Yeah, that there's going to actually be a challenge there.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
We say, my husband always says adoption's messy and it's hard and it's uncomfortable, but it's good. So it's
Yes, just like most things that stretch our faith. It is hard, but like you said, good. So I guess we're almost out of time here. I guess my last question would be, are there any misconceptions in our culture about adoption that you'd like to refute, or any misconceptions in the Christian culture that you'd like to refute?
I think there's probably are a lot of misconceptions, but I think that we touched on the one, which is adoption is not a calling, which we talked about that already. I know that one of my friends, she says every time she tells them that we've adopted all these kids, they say, oh, they must be really wealthy. And I think that that's another misconception, that if you've adopted many kids, that you have to have a certain amount of money. We have friends that are full-time missionaries, and they're now adopting their 10th daughter with severe CP, and they have all their kids have severe CP. So they have only 2 that walk, and the rest are all either wheelchair bound or bed bound. And they're full-time missionaries. And so if they can do it on their meager salary, it's not for the wealthy, it's for the faithful. And so that would be another misconception. And I guess it's just because it's hard doesn't mean it's easy to say yes to the coffee ministry. That's not a hard one to say yes to. Saying yes to having a child in your home 24/7 for the next however many years, especially if they have special needs, could be a lot longer. It's a lot harder. So
yes. All right. Well, I think that you gave a lot of awesome information. I personally feel encouraged. I'm excited about adoption, and I know that a lot of people listening are interested as well. I guess maybe one last question. Where would you encourage us to start?
I always tell people to start somewhere. But the most important thing is to start in prayer, and be prayerful and asking the Lord to lead you. And then my encouragement would be to study Job 29 and Job 31. And people are like, Job, you always think of James 1:27 as your go-to verse. But when you study Job, God said Job was righteous, and he pointed him out to Satan. He said, "Hey, Satan, have you seen Job? He's above reproach. Have you considered him, Satan?" And it's like, why, God, are you pointing out this guy, to Satan? And when you read Job's own defense for why God saw him as righteous, and it was because he said he cared for the fatherless while he was in his mother's womb, he was caring for the fatherless. And so the example was set for him. He obviously was a caretaker of orphans. He had widows in his house. He was worried about justice. He was going to break the fangs of evil. And when you study those passages, you're like, oh my goodness, if we always think of Job suffering, but do we realize Job suffered, but he was above he was the top person for God to point out and say, hey, consider Job. And so if we want to be like Job, and most people are afraid of Job because they're afraid they're going to suffer. But he suffered because he was who he was and his relationship with the Lord. And so I say start there with the verses in Job, and also attend a free seminar. There's tons of free seminars at most area adoption agencies will allow you to go to a free information night, and you can find out about domestic adoption, foster care, international adoption. And then the other thing is you can fill out a preliminary application with any adoption agency online, and they're free, and they'll tell you which countries you qualify for. They can give you more information about the cost and what's involved and get the home study started. And then, like you mentioned, Reese's Rainbow is one of the clearinghouses. Terrible word, but it is what it is. It's helping to get these kids out there so you can see their faces, because once you see a face, you're more likely to make a connection. And then there's another one called Rainbow Kids. And Rainbow Kids is another big, giant one where lots of kids, and you can actually filter it specifically by special need. You can say, if you only want to look for kids with Down syndrome or those that have cerebral palsy or whatever, you can pick just that special need and a specific age, and they'll give you a list of all the kids that meet those criteria. So
Wow.
I would say those are good starting points.
Yes, yes. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dawn, for giving us your time and for being an example of faithfulness.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Monstrous Regiment. We hope this podcast inspires and equips you to go and exercise dominion for Christ's kingdom, terrible as an army with banners. The Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network brings to you a complete lineup of podcasts where you will hear practical and tactical theology. Our desire is not simply that you consume our shows, but that you also live out your faith in every area of life. We can talk all day long about these things, but if we fail to put them into practice, then we fail as ambassadors of Jesus Christ, our King. Subscribe now to your favorite Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network shows, or you can subscribe to the Reconstructionist Radio Master Feed, where all of the content we produce, including the audiobooks and audio articles, will pop up as soon as they are available. And don't forget to visit reconstructionistradio.com to volunteer as a narrator or to partner with this ministry financially. May the Holy Spirit stir you into action for Christ and His kingdom.